Holy smokes, you guys, Russia's making its boldest geopolitical gamble in decades, and it's happening right where almost no one is looking. The Kremlin's deploying mercenaries, airlift units, and intelligence teams across the volatile arc of countries in the Sahel, from Mali to Sudan. But the shoe is now on the other glove, as the expression goes, because they're facing these same exact challenges that Western troops battled for years. Russian forces are fighting against Al-Qaeda militants who are closing in on the capital of Mali, attempting to take it over, and they have a security footprint in Sudan, which is collapsing, and there are reports of genocide occurring there. And so today, we're going to examine 3 of the reasons why Russia's diverting so much combat power and resources to Africa. Let's find out. A RAND Corporation analysis first spotted Wagner Group operatives working as advisors in the Central African Republic in 2017. In the years that followed, Russian private mercenary companies signed official security contracts with at least 6 African governments. These deployments had what are called operational spillover, where the fighting bleeds into neighboring countries as refugees cross borders. This spillover creates new opportunities that emerge for even more mercenary outfits to move in. It's a vicious economic cycle of conflict that Sean McFate, a professor at the U.S. National Defense University, calls conflict markets. Conflict markets are regions that, in his words, are rich in natural resources, political rivalries, post-colonial grievances, and are short on rule of law. Another way of saying that is that it's the perfect breeding ground for modern mercenary industrial complex that Big Boss would die for. But if you're thinking of launching your own private military company, there's more to it than just the fun part of providing plausibly deniable solutions. That's why I use today's sponsor, Odoo, the business management software. All your e-signatures, HR, accounting, and project tracking can now be accomplished in one neat place. This is why, whether you're running a private military company that specializes in toppling governments, or you run a small online retail business or a YouTube channel, Odoo has a solution for you. It's incredibly easy and intuitive to use. Personally, I like that it's just plug and play style, so I'm able to incorporate it into my business quickly. And now my dream of expanding into offering security services for foreign nations is that much easier. I track each step of our episode's creation in Odoo with my team of 3, but it would easily be able to track a PMC's progress of capturing villages too. All these invoices that you get from customers or ruthless dictators are all in one place. If you're running any kind of small business or big business, try Odoo for 15 days free, no credit card required. Any single app is free forever. Just click my link in the description down below or the pinned comment. Now, a lot of people are probably thinking, who cares what happens on the African continent? Let them sort it out themselves. And that's a fair question to ask. Part of the reason I think why Western and Eastern countries have always struggled to step back is because you guessed it, resources. Africa holds a massive share of minerals that power the 21st century economy, including cobalt, copper, and platinum metals that are scattered across the continent. I'm an infantryman, not a geologist, but I know that those are the building blocks for modern life that have made me so soft today. Every electronic vehicle battery, every drone, every smartphone, and every one of those monster data centers being built around the world right now rely on these materials. So from a pragmatic point of view, when instability spreads through Africa like in Sudan and Mali, it becomes a global problem. From a humanitarian point of view, they would make the case that other countries should try to reduce the suffering there, while others say intervening only makes things worse. And it has of course been this way for a long time, because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union quietly built one of their largest military footprints in Africa that most people today have completely forgotten about. As the old European empires collapsed and colonial powers pulled out, Moscow moved in to fill the vacuum and offer a communist-flavored alternative. By the mid-1950s, Soviet advisors were arriving in Egypt, supplying Nasser's army with tanks, MiG fighter jets, and training. In Algeria, they funneled weapons to the National Liberation Front through Egypt and Czechoslovakia during its war of independence from France. That legacy is still visible to this very day. You see it in the AK-47s carried by militias, to the Soviet anti-aircraft guns welded to the back of pickup trucks across the whole continent. Through the 1960s and 70s, Soviet involvement deepened as they went from dipping their toes to dipping their whole body. In Angola, Moscow poured in thousands of tons of weapons and sent military advisors to back their Marxist government. The Soviets established strong ties with Mozambique, Libya, and Guinea. They basically transformed their infrastructure into logistics hubs for the Red Navy and outposts for KGB intelligence that has its vestigials to this day. Who said making friends in your middle age is difficult? fault. The Soviets were the mysterious new kid that just moved into town and everyone thought were really cool because there were rumors that they'd been arrested before. All of this is important context to know because by the early 1980s, the Soviet Union had built this vast geopolitical network stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. In Somalia, they operated one of Africa's longest runways. From there, they moved to the Dahlak Islands in the Red Sea, where they had just a massive naval submarine base. On the west coast in Angola, it served as a refueling and repair hub, while Guinea acted as an Atlantic logistics stop. You could think of it this way: Soviet ships could circle all of Africa without ever leaving friendly waters. It was an Africa cheat code. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, all that we just covered pretty much vanished overnight. Russia lost its ports, its bases, and most of its allies in Africa. The once global Soviet Navy had no money or mission left to sustain that reach. For the next 3 decades, Russia's presence in Africa disappeared. This, of course, is until the rise of the private military companies like Wagner, which have quietly started to try to rebuild Moscow's influence. But the multi-billion-dollar geopolitical question is, will it work? So here's how it works for Russia in Africa. Wagner has a front company that owns a gold processing plant in Sudan, for instance, but getting the gold back to Russia is an absolute trip because of international sanctions against them. So US intelligence identified a fleet of Russian cargo planes that smuggle gold from the processing plant through Khartoum and Sudan airports to the UAE. From there, the secret packages get shuffled into an identical plane that flies the illicit gold to Moscow like some kind of Bond villain plot. An investigative research firm that tracks this type of activity, called the Blood Gold Report, estimates Moscow has smuggled some $2.5 billion worth of gold this way since 2022. In the Central African Republic, there are diamonds and oil, of course. In Niger, there is a big supply of uranium for nuclear weapons and power. 9 of the 10 largest cobalt mines in the world are all in the Dominican Republic of Congo, which provides 70% of the world's supply, worth over $2.5 billion a year, which scientifically speaking is a lot. That's one of the reasons that Russia's taking such a keen interest in Africa all of a sudden. Economic sanctions on the Russian Federation has meant that cash and raw resources from Africa are an important source of income that goes towards supporting their war effort. While the Wagner Group are independent corporation on paper, the reality is in Russia that these are partially state-funded entities. So what does that mean? It means that the Russian government gets revenue from these operations. The semi-independent relationship between Moscow and these outfits also gives the Russian government a plausible deniable extension of its power. And plausible deniable power is the best kind of power, you guys. It's the have your cake and eat it too of security geopolitics. But we're not that shallow here. We know money isn't everything. The reason Russia's prioritizing Africa goes much deeper than just money. In an article written for the Center for European Policy Analysis, Michael Albanese outlines what he believes is Russia's long-term strategy in Africa, saying, quote, Russian operations in Africa are not just about fomenting instability or profiting from resource extraction. They are also part of a long game to make the continent a front in a global confrontation with the West. US officials have warned that Russia may soon begin coordinating its war effort with China in an attempt to open multiple theaters of conflict, forcing the United States and its allies to split their attention, stretch resources, and confront crisis across the globe. Mind explode. If that analysis is correct, if we assume that that's what's happening, Africa is a strategic foothold for dictating the pace of future conflicts. Let me know in the comments section if you agree or disagree with that quote and what reasoning you have for your answer. It's due by the end of tomorrow. One of the most key reasons that Russia is increasing activity on the continent right now is because of political support. This aspect helps explain a lot of what we're observing. According to the Associated Press, quote, Moscow is also seeking political support or at least neutrality from many of Africa's 54 countries over its invasion of Ukraine. African nations make up one of the largest voting blocs at the United Nations and have been more divided than any other group of General Assembly resolutions criticizing Russia's actions in Ukraine, end quote. So by assisting in helping the key leadership across the Sahel, it paves the way for influence operations that any foreign country may engage in. The way it has worked for decades is the same way it worked for my old squad leader and me. You scratch my back, and I'll scratch your grundle. Africa holds 1/4 of the United Nations General Assembly votes. That's enormous amount of soft power. When Russia, China, and the West want legitimacy for any of global initiative or to block resolutions like condemning Russia's invasion, for instance, African votes are decisive. This makes Africa the swing continent of the 21st century diplomacy, especially as great power competition intensifies. That abstention bloc helped Moscow avoid total diplomatic isolation. It weakened the impact of Western attempts to rally a quote-unquote global consensus. This all sounds kind of heady for someone like me who often just analyzes weapon systems, so I need this in the form of an example. The perfect example of how it has tangible consequences is back in 2019, Russia-backed candidate won control of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization thanks to African and Latin American votes, giving Moscow influence over global food security policy just before the Ukraine grain crisis. If you're an ambitious strongman or an aspiring dictator in Africa today, the first thing you're going to go shopping for is a security partner. And for decades, that usually meant bringing in Western militaries for training and counterintelligence and counterterrorism assistance. But Western forces came with all kinds of strings attached, strict rules of combat engagement, and limited authority to operate offensively, relatively speaking. The one major exception, of course, was drone strikes. The United States went absolutely ham with drone strikes across the Sahel. At its height, Niger hosted over 1,000 American troops in the second largest U.S. base in all of Africa. Then there was this political earthquake of 2023. A military coup ousted President Bazoum, with the junta accusing his government of failing to stop years of terrorist attacks. Anti-Western sentiment that was fueled by anger over colonial-era influence and security failures made Russia look like this ideal alternative partner. Within months, the junta expelled U.S. forces, and when the last American transport plane left the runway in 2024, Wagner Group fighters were already unloading their cargo on the same tarmac. It was one of those historically awkward moments. Two groups made hard eye contact with one another, and the pendulum swung hard. Where Western partners preferred to advise from the backseat, a new brand of security contractor had arrived in Africa, and they were willing to take the wheel. Groups like Wagner went into town, boots on the ground, taking frontline roles in battles, and cultivating this kind of take-no-prisoners reputation. That posture was designed to fill a demand for governments who were desperate for immediate visible security gains, especially where the state's monopoly on violence was weak. On paper, a contractor like this would look like an ideal partner. A major reason for why Russia is doubling down in Africa right now is because there's been this collapse of key logistics hubs in places like Syria. The port at Tartus and their airbase have been closed down for a period of time, and even if they are reopened eventually and their control over them is reignited, that could change at any moment, Russia's realized. So the Russian Ministry of Defense plans to build a series of new air hubs and naval bases in contracted nations to make up for the loss of Syrian locations and to try to rebuild some of that infrastructure that we learned they had during the Soviet Union. Russian forces in Sudan switched their alliance from backing the Rapid Support Forces faction to supporting the Sudanese armed forces instead. And the reason for this is so they could be able to have signed off on plans to build a brand new naval base in Sudan. Add on to this their coming base in Libya, and these network of bases will make it easier for Russia to logistically push deeper into Africa and support further operations. But keeping control in a volatile region like the Sahel has proven incredibly difficult for security forces for decades. The country of Mali is a perfect example of this. Mali's been through various stages of war and insurgency since 2012. Since then, rebels, jihadists, and international terror groups, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda, have joined the fray against both the government themselves, Western forces. They fought against Eastern forces. It's been an absolute cluster. As a former French colony, the country first relied on the French military for help, yet despite early success, the country was still racked by war and instability. So in 2021, the new military junta kicked out the French and UN forces in favor of Russian Wagner contractors who promised to solve Mali's security problems with a no-holds-barred. They promised to go gloves off, bare-knuckle, no Geneva Convention style. Wagner paramilitary were officially in the country just to train the Malian armed forces and provide close protection for their high-level officials, But what happened since then is one of the reasons why Russia is attempting to expand more into Russia today, because they're trying to score a victory in creating stability in a nation. And if they could achieve that, this could lead to greater influence and prestige for them. But it has not been easy. This attempt started in 2021 when they were already engaged in combat with jihadist groups in the north of the country. For the next several years, the Russian mercenaries retook rebel strongholds and they rampaged through villages that they believed supported terrorists. Wagner set up their own bases deep in contested regions, using them as kind of staging areas for patrols and raids. Fighting was intense. Mali's military junta initially seemed happy with their new partnership. They gained control over the northern territories. The Tuareg rebels were retreating deeper into the desert, it seemed. But on July 20th, the Russian 13th Storm Brigade of the Wagner forces attempted something new, and it changed everything. An armored convoy was marauding through the remote towns near the border with Algeria for several days, and they would attack villages and hunt down rebel tribes in their own home turf. It was a much larger, more complex undertaking than they were used to. They deployed 20 armored vehicles that were supported by helicopters from a nearby base. But unknown to the Russian mercenaries, the rebels were busy building an unholy alliance between different jihadist groups. The former enemies agreed to work together against the Russians. The uneasy alliance hatched a plan then to trap the Russians in a kill zone of their own making. And this battle would have geopolitical implications that extend to today. The Russian convoy captured village after village, driving the separatists into retreat. Their strategy was to make anyone too afraid of Wagner reprisals to shelter any rebel fighters. But this turned out to all be a part of the jihadist plan. They were using this hit and fade tactic. The enemy had no trouble tracking the large Russian convoy through territories that they knew well, and the Russian mercenaries were eager to pursue the retreating rebels. It seemed that they were retreating, but they were getting drawn into more and more difficult terrain. Up ahead, the rebels prepared the next phase of their plan. On July 24th, a roadside bomb disabled one of the Russian convoy's armored trucks. The next day, a second IED forced the convoy off the planned route and toward an alternate path. The road ahead was much rougher and poorly scouted, so the Russian mercenaries continued to what they thought was the rebel stronghold. Their vehicles got stuck in the sand, and just then the rebels sprung their trap. All hell broke loose as rebels and jihadists attacked over the sand dunes and from atop canyon walls. The Wagner fighters were completely surrounded. They dismounted and fought back. They struggled to get their vehicles moving again. In the first few hours of the battle, machine guns, mortars, and RPGs ripped through both sides. 10 Malayan soldiers fell along with 5 Russian contractors right away. The convoy was forced to call for an evac from the airbase. That's when 2 Mi-24 gunship helicopters took off to provide air support. One of the helicopters was shot down en route. The other was forced to turn back as a sandstorm started moving their way. The Wagner mercenaries took shelter where they could for the night, and the next day, over 1,000 enemy fighters came in on their position, and they were firing down into the stranded convoy of just about 100 or so remaining Russian and Malayan fighters. The convoy desperately tried to call for reinforcements, but no one was coming. On the third day, they were pinned down and running low on ammunition, and a few Russian mercenaries were able to get a connection on their mobile phones. They sent messages home through Telegram describing how the rebels were now using FPV-style attack drones against them. One of the contractors wrote a final text that I thought was rough to read, and it simply said, "I'm not afraid to die. What hurts me is that everything ends this way, disgracefully surrounded, and I'll forever remain on this African soil." The final few survivors surrendered to the rebels. The battle went viral across the internet. Wagner losses were said to range from between 25 to possibly up to over 85. The defeat at the hands of Al-Qaeda and that affiliated group in 2024 seemed to be the last straw for the Wagner Group, especially after the Prigozhin rebellion and now this. The security situation in Wagner contracted countries didn't seem to improve despite years of continual operations. On June 6, 2025, the Wagner Group announced the completion of their mission in Mali. This move was interpreted by many people as the Kremlin terminating their Wagner contract in Africa. Instead, Moscow is moving on to a new player, though. That's not the end for them, because they're now moving to the infamous Africa Corps. And the investment in the Africa Corps shows that Africa is still a big commitment for Russia. Compared to the Wagner Group, the Africa Corps is firmly under the control of the Russian Ministry of Defense. They have a more tightly controlled command structure, is my understanding, and that makes them more politically reliable compared to Wagner. In December 2024, around 1,000 contractors from Russia's Africa Corps deployed to Mali, and 80% of those were actually made up of former Wagner veterans. There's one major drawback, though, to replacing them, is that they're more closely aligned with the Kremlin, which means that they lose some of that plausible deniability. By using Africa resources to rebuild Russia, Moscow hopes to deny the United States and its allies any of these advantages. Moscow hopes to work in coordination with China to gain a foothold inside Africa and possibly use it to their advantage in a future major war. And that's why Russia's expanding into Africa now more than ever before. If you found this video interesting, I think you'll really like this one about how the CIA backed a sting operation to try to capture Russian mercenaries in Belarus. It was a crazy espionage story that I think you'll enjoy. Or this one over here too, if you're into that kind of thing.